Discussions on economics. Education. Education for sustainable development.
Did you know that education for sustainable development is crucial to empowering people to have the knowledge, skills, values, and attitudes to meet sustainable development challenges?
Yes, I've heard that before, but I'm not sure how it works in practice.
ESD enables learners to develop their cognitive and non-cognitive skills, such as critical thinking, problem solving, and coping with complexity and risk, empowering them to take responsible action as citizens.
That's interesting. But how accessible is ESD to everyone?
In regions with a high level of socioeconomic development, schools begin to include education for sustainability in the school curriculum from kindergarten. However, children who live in socioeconomically underdeveloped communities remain marginalized, without access to education that allows them to develop the necessary skills to deal with the consequences of the destruction promoted by previous generations.
Wow, that's a significant issue. Do you have any examples of where this is happening?
For example, in the outskirts of the city of Recife, Brazil, children do not have access to education that allows them to think of new ways of living, guaranteeing the regeneration of the environment and the survival of the planet.
That's terrible. What can we do to help?
We need to support initiatives that promote ESD in underdeveloped communities and advocate for its inclusion in the school curriculum worldwide.
I agree. Education is a powerful tool for positive change and can help us create a sustainable future.
Should there be trigger warnings in education?
I read an article about trigger warnings in education. What do you think about them?
It's a controversial topic. Some people argue that trigger warnings are necessary to protect students from emotional distress.
I can see that, but others argue that trigger warnings could restrict access to information. What's your take on that?
Yes, critics argue that trigger warnings could lead to the reduction and eventual elimination of difficult material, and thus connect it to concerns about paternalism.
That makes sense. But proponents of trigger warnings see their inclusion on syllabi as consistent with the trend of transparency and clear communication of course content in advance. What do you think about that?
I understand that, but critics worry that it will lead to constraints on the traditional faculty prerogative to set curriculum in the way that they see appropriate.
So, what policies should educational institutions adopt regarding trigger warnings?
It's a complex issue with valid arguments on both sides. Ultimately, it's up to each institution to determine their policy based on their values and mission.
Should comprehensive sex education be mandatory?
Proponents of trigger warnings argue that they can help students who have experienced trauma, such as sexual assault or violence, to avoid re-traumatization.
I can see why that would be important. What's the argument against trigger warnings?
Critics argue that trigger warnings stifle free speech and academic freedom, and that they coddle students who need to be exposed to different viewpoints and experiences.
That's a valid point. Is there any data on the effectiveness of trigger warnings?
There is limited research on the effectiveness of trigger warnings, but some studies suggest that they may have a positive impact on students' mental health and academic performance.
Interesting. So, what's the conclusion on whether there should be sex education?
It's a complex issue with valid arguments on both sides. Ultimately, it's up to individual institutions and instructors to decide whether to implement sex education in their courses.